Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we're going to be analyzing a movie that was put out around 7 years ago. That's right. It was put out about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was available only in a limited number of theaters, and it was only very highly controlled on the internet. I have been searching and looking and trying to find a way to see this movie for about 4 or 5 years. So I recently was able to view it. And the way I was able to do it is because they required that you sign up for a Roku account, a streaming service account, free account. And so I said, great, I'll just sign up for Roku, and then it was available on Roku. So finally, after searching the internet for 4 or 5 years, I could not find this in libraries. I could not find this without having to pay a huge fine or fee to stream it online. But now I found it for free on Roku, and it's called Same God. It's a documentary about Professor Larisha Hawkins, who was a former professor at Wheaton College, my old alma mater, and she was basically fired in 2016 for making confusing and contradictory statements about Christianity and Islam. And she made some controversial posts on Facebook, basically saying that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, and we are all people of the same book, and making some and she's going to wear the hijab, the head covering that women do in Islamic nations, and saying that she stands in solidarity with her Muslim sisters, so she's going to wear the hijab, and just expressing herself in a very confusing way. And she's doing this at the heart of the evangelical Christian college, Wheaton College, which is like the top tier evangelical, Bible-believing Christian college in the country, perhaps in the world. And so she was very confusing in her posts. And then the problem was she never, ever did express herself or explain herself or agree to sit down with someone who would ask her hard questions about what are you actually talking about, and can you defend what you are saying rationally and scholarly and academically. And that was always the big curiosity I had. Why isn't a woman who is an academic, who has a PhD, who's a professor, a full professor, or has tenure at a college, why isn't she going out of her way to actually justify and explain her views on Islam and Christianity? Why doesn't she do that? But she didn't do that. And I made a video, I think about 5 years ago, about this whole controversy because of being a Wheaton College graduate, because I know that the important emphasis at Wheaton College has always been faith and learning, and the integration of your Christian faith and the academic scholarly world of today. So you either explain why ideas that are floating around the world today are compatible with Christianity, or you explain why they are not compatible with Christianity, and you go about refuting them and correcting them and say, this is wrong and this is right. So you're able to discern, whereas the average Christian, the average person on the street may not have the time or inclination or ability to actually articulate what Christianity is consistently with the Bible and why this idea or that idea is right or wrong. But Wheaton College emphasizes that they are a place where students can come to integrate their faith and learning and understand and develop a Christian worldview. So here is a woman, a professor at Wheaton College, who says some controversial statements, very controversial statements. And she says it at the heart of evangelicalism at Wheaton College, and yet she does not welcome inquiries. She doesn't want to or take the time to sit down and actually articulate what she's actually talking about. And that was so frustrating for me. I've done a couple videos on it. If you look back 3 or 4 years ago, you'll find that I've done some videos on this and explaining why she was justified in being let go at Wheaton College, and that Wheaton College really needs to make sure that the professors that they have there are defenders of the Christian faith and not drifting into this sort of progressivism. That's the new word for liberalism, progressive Christian. Instead of a liberal Christian, it's progressive Christian. They say they're progressing beyond fundamentalism, or they're progressing beyond the mere biblical literalists. Well, evangelicalism and Wheaton College are known as Bible-believing Christian institutions, and we need to be able to defend our faith and not just drift into this mishy-mushy, squishy liberalism that goes under the name progressivism. But Alicia Hawkins evidently is one of those squishy evangelical progressives. So they're wanting to sort of open the evangelicalism up to more of the world and to blend it together. I know that there was a movement called the Abrahamic Faith Movement, and you might have heard of. I think there was an author named Filer who wrote a book about the Abrahamic religions and the Abrahamic faith and monotheism, and he defends that Christians, Muslims, and Jews all should be able to live in harmony and have a similar worldview because of their shared Abrahamic faith. They all trace their faith back to Abraham. Well, that scheme and that strategy does not work because you have a common ancestor, Abraham, but the way the Muslims have taken that understanding of Abraham and distorted it and twisted it and introduced so many false and erroneous teachings that there's no way, for example, the Jews can sit down with the Muslims and be in harmony theologically because of all the distortions and edits that the Muslims have made to the Jewish scriptures. And it's a wonder whether, for example, a Muslim like Abraham, who was the author, who was the source for the information in the Quran, it's a question as to whether he even had access to all of the teachings of the Old Testament, and certainly he didn't have access to all of the teachings of the New Testament because he didn't seem to understand very basic things about not only Judaism but Christianity. So he had bits and pieces, he pulled them all together, and we have the Quran for the Muslims, and it's not a faithful representation of the Old Testament. So you're dealing with, in Islam, you're dealing with a distorted Judaism that has departed so much from the original Judaism that you cannot call these faiths, even though they originate from Abraham, similar. And the same way with Christianity. Jesus is mentioned in the Quran, but the Jesus of Islam is not the Savior of the world. He did not die on the cross for the sins of the world. And Islam specifically says that God is one and he does not have a son. So they're directly contradicting the Christian message. So they're not only in combat mode against Judaism, they're also in combat mode against Christianity. They're in combat mode with a lot of people, but the Islamic faith is totally distorted, and so there's no chance that you can have this common Abrahamic, quote, religion. And progressives want that to happen. They want an Abrahamic religion because a lot of the truths of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, they don't take seriously anyway. So they're just saying, well, why are we all fighting? All of this stuff is just man-made religion anyway. So there's a lot of just skeptical doubt that is in the progressive camp, and they just say, well, what are we fighting for? We don't even know if we really believe any of these stories anyway, so let's just call a truce and get along. So Alicia Hawkins comes along and makes these vague, nebulous statements, and of course, concerned evangelicals are very bothered and said, well, wait a minute, this sounds like squishy progressivism, and she needs to clarify herself. Well, this movie, Same God, is her attempt to try to justify her actions and explain what happened. And unfortunately, it does not do any of that. It is a hit piece on Wheaton College. It accuses Wheaton College of pandering to donors, and money is their basic motive, follow the money. So she's basically claiming that this Christian institution, Wheaton College, is ruled by the money concerns rather than theological or spiritual or biblical concerns, which is a slander. No, it isn't. And she's also accusing Wheaton College of racism because she happens to be black, and they fired her, a black woman. And then there's also hints that she's also accusing Wheaton College of being misogynistic because she's a woman, and chauvinistic, and she has feminists standing with her, and she has activists standing with her. She has progressives standing with her, Islamic spokesman standing with her. She has the whole Abrahamic, progressive, liberal wing of religion in solidarity with her against the mean evangelicals who wouldn't put up with her vague and nebulous statements about Islam and Christianity. That's her movie. That's the entire documentary. And what I was wanting to see in the documentary and waiting to see, because, like I said, I've been searching for this movie for 3 or 4 years to try to figure out how to get to it to see it. And it's not in libraries. You can't just view it on Amazon or Netflix or any of these streaming services without paying this huge rental fee. And so finally, I did see it. It was available on Roku for free. I took the opportunity to see it. It does not contain any more content and justification and defense of her controversial statements than I had already read in the newspapers. And her defense of saying, hey, well, after all, we worship the same God as the Muslims. And just like Pope Francis said, we worship the same God. And I've done a video on that and how that's so shallow. And first of all, if you say something like, we all worship the same God, then that prompts you to then take the extra step and say, okay, here's why we all worship the same God. And then you have to spell out your justification and your reasons for making that statement. She never does during the movie. You would think that all during this documentary, it's an hour and a half or so, she would sit down with an interviewer, and the interviewer would say, I'm sure you've studied this, Dr. Hawkins, quite a bit now, if you hadn't before. Do you have positive proof and reasons why you believe that Christians and Muslims worship the same God? Because that's very controversial. And what are your answers to the refutations of Christians who say you're wrong? You would think that there would be a whole segment in this documentary spelling out her justification for making that statement. And there isn't. There isn't. Very non-intellectual, this movie is. It's almost all completely about politics and how she doesn't like Trump, and she doesn't like Republicans, and she doesn't like evangelical conservatives, and how the evangelical Christian movement has been captured by the right wing, and it is so political, and it makes perfect sense because after she made her controversial statements that deserve to be explained, she runs and goes and takes all of the support from the liberal, leftist, progressivist people in society. So when she makes her public speeches, and you can go back on YouTube and see all of these little press conferences, whatnot, she's always surrounded not by the Bible-believing evangelical Christians who are solidly scholars and who are known to be credible Bible scholars or worldview professors. No, they're all these leftist activist types. I mean, there was even Jesse Jackson came to her side to defend her. Jesse Jackson, the black activist. And so this makes perfect sense because she's not her professor emphasis, her field of study is politics. And so she treated this whole controversy as a political issue rather than a scholarly issue. You would think that here's this PhD, professor at Wheaton College, a tenured professor. She would say, great, I have an opportunity to address the world. I have a platform. I have a microphone. I have a megaphone now. The cameras are on me. The microphones are on me. People want to interview me. Great. I will sit down and defend my ideas and statements that I make. Isn't that what professors just dream about? To have an audience so that they can teach and lecture and refute errors that contradict their position and defend ideas that buttress their position. Wouldn't you think a professor's dream, professor's heaven, would have an audience so that they would teach the crowd the truth if they really believe that what they're teaching is the truth? Yes. And yet, no, she does not take that opportunity to defend her ideas, and she uses it as an opportunity to politically lobby Wheaton College to change its perspective, to move away from the right-wing conservative Christianity. And she's aligning herself with all of these left-wing activists and black activists and feminists and even the LGBTQ and all of the assorted Democratic, liberal, leftist activists. So what is up with this? Now, I saw that and I was bothered by it. And I think that's probably why Wheaton College decided to drop her, because she wouldn't engage on the issues. But here is what Wheaton College did wrong. Instead of seeing this as a teachable moment and an opportunity for this community of academic scholars to engage in its own teaching ministry, and after all, isn't that what an academic institution is all about? Teaching, educating, informing, persuading, influencing people in clear thinking, theology, thinking about God. We have a lot of confusion today in the world. These professors and administrators are all dedicated, we assume, to educating people and helping them think clearly about issues, right? Isn't that what something like a Wheaton College or any higher education institution would be about? You would think so. So you would think they would jump, just like I said that Alicia Hawkins would jump at the chance, you would think, to explain her ideas before a crowd. So too, you would think Wheaton College would jump at the chance to dive into this issue, this controversy. But instead of acting like an academic institution, a teaching institution, a scholarly institution, they reacted in the public relations direction and saw it as a threat to their brand, I guess, at Wheaton College. So on the one hand, they knew that they couldn't just let a professor confuse Christianity and Islam and make very confusing spiritual theological statements, because that would muddy the evangelical brand. And so they knew they needed her to leave or change or repent and conform to biblical Christianity, or they would have to fire her. So finally, when it became clear that she was not willing to dialogue or sit down or have a mature adult theological discussion with the administration, they decided to let her go. But again, why didn't the administration and the professors and the faculty say, look, let's use this as a teaching opportunity to show the world how to, one, discuss controversial issues in a loving and Christian way, and two, give the different sides of this issue, if there are different sides. I mean, I don't know how many people at Wheaton College actually believe that Christians and Muslims worship God the same way, or the same God, because that's a very controversial statement. It needs to be defended and refuted. And so you would have thought, okay, let's set up a campus-wide meeting in the chapel or some appropriate place. Let's set up a dialogue, a discussion where both sides can present their case for their position. So Alicia Hawkins would come in and defend the thesis that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. And she would have, 20 minutes, half an hour to lay out her case. Then the opposite side, some faculty member or some scholar, could be a guest scholar maybe, to not actually have faculty against one another, but that wouldn't be that bad. I mean, this is a scholarly community, Wheaton College. They should be mature enough to be able to do this without anger and rancor and anger. So bring up and spend an hour or two on an evening and do that, and then maybe have a part two the next night and go over it again. But thoroughly cover the topic as a responsible academic scholarly community you would think would do it. It's, for example, like Martin Luther during the Reformation time. When Luther's theses, the 95 Theses, caught the attention of the authorities and they wanted to challenge him, he had challenged them to a debate, and they said yes. He was grateful because he could have his views aired, okay? Finally, he could get his airs out, his ideas out. That's the same way this Professor Hawkins should have said, great, I get a forum to view, to discuss my errors. And if I am in error, then I will change. And if I think my opponents are in error, then they would change. But let the students, let the Wheaton community, and let the community at larger Christian evangelical community hear these discussions. And it could have been a real teachable moment. She didn't want to do that, but the sad thing about it is Wheaton College itself didn't want to do that. And the reason they didn't want to do that is because they felt that the PR, public relations risk of that was too much. And they didn't want to see any disharmony. They didn't want to show any debate or conversation about a controversy. That's like the rule of marketing, avoid controversy. So that's what you'll get in the church growth movement. You'll have churches, mega churches saying, well, we stay clear of controversy. If it's controversial in the public, we stay clear of it. We don't want to address it. It might rile up too many people. People might get angry with one another, and so on and so forth. So Wheaton College fumbled the football, so to speak, didn't call for a campus-wide discussion, and resolved this like a true academic community. But perhaps one of the problems was that Alicia Hawkins did not want to talk about these issues publicly. And she showed no sign or any inkling to even talk about them. She didn't use her platform in this documentary to sit down with anyone and explain her views. It was all a political move on her part. And it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder how many evangelical Christians, and especially academics in the evangelical world, are actually interested in dialogue and debate. Or are they more interested in trying to push an agenda that they feel strongly about? Because this movie was a big disappointment. A lot of unfair statements were made in this movie. It never did address the whole idea of, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? There were some professors who started to go in that direction. They actually made some statements about, there was one Wheaton College professor who is being interviewed, who made some statements about, well, the early church fathers saw Islam as a Christian heresy. And there were some other professors who started to go down that road, but then they wouldn't let it go very far. So in other words, they just showed the fact that there was a controversy and that there are some different views on this whole issue, whether Christians worship the same God as Muslims or Muslims worship the same God as Christians. They started to go down that road, but they didn't open it up. And so you have no progress in this controversy. I don't know if Wheaton College even tried to answer the question since then. I think they're thinking it's just safer to avoid it and just move on and carry out the agenda of educating students. But again, you're bypassing teachable moments. So the documentary was a disappointment. I'm glad I was able to see this documentary, but it was actually worse than I thought it was, because I actually thought that this professor who was let go from Wheaton College would actually try to justify her posts. And all I saw was obstinance, stubbornness. There was a defiance on her part to have anyone tell her or question her. She was offended that a Christian institution would actually question her and her views. And instead of sitting down and explaining herself, she was willing to take it political. And there's no doubt she made it political. And then criticized the university for the handling of it. And just very, very one-sided. There were very few, if any, people who would take the college's side on this or the mainstream evangelical side on this in the documentary. Hardly any. But all the interviewers were almost all sympathetic with this woman who used emotion and all kinds of persuasive tricks to get people on her side without actually defending her views. So that was a big disappointment. This was not a real fair movie anyway. But I'm glad I got to see it. Well, I hope that's been helpful. We'll talk to you next week. God bless.